So welcome everyone. This is a really exciting time in the validator world, and we have some really exciting new features we want to show you guys. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Agee. I'm the head of product over here at Validator, and I am just dying to show you guys all the stuff that we have coming. So let's dive in, and we will get started. So what is new at Validator? We have released, just in the past couple of months, some really game-changing capabilities. And the first of those that we're going to be highlighting today is the ability to use Validator in a kind of no-code manner. And so we have added the capability to create macros such that you can use reusable code throughout the various connections with your data sources. And those macros can have snippets of SQL or Python or anything. So we will dive into that. The other items that we're going to kind of dive into today, new features, include our addition of an overall test result status. You will see that this is there to enable you to see kind of with a single value what is the status of a test. And to get a sense of its history and what's been going on there. Additionally, we're going to talk about the new standard fields, which are test severity and our quality dimension field, and show how important it is to document those things per test, and then what that means for downstream analytics and notifications. Finally, for our Snowflake customers and anyone using the Powered by Snowflake capabilities, and particularly also anyone on Validator Cloud, we're going to talk about our Snowflake replication and some of the reporting enhancements that come with that. And so we're going to, and then finally, we have some announcements about some community classes that we're going to be hosting in this summer. And wanted to get those on everyone's radar, and talk about what's included and covered in some of those training classes that will be kind of for the broader community to join as needed, and not customer specific. So that's the agenda for today. If you guys have questions, please submit the questions through through Zoom, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So I have that popped up over on my other window, and I should be able to take them as we dive in. Okay, so pulling up one other thing that I need to pull up, but here we dive in. Oh, and oh my goodness. Sorry, my one example is popping up on my screen. Okay, wonderful. So before I get started, I do want to mention that all of these features are due to the wonderful work that our dev team has done, their tireless efforts, and I cannot be prouder to work with another set of folks. So if you see them in the hallways, or if you remember their names, feel free to give them some kudos, because there's some really cool things they've built out here. So I love working with all of them, and it's a team effort all around. Okay, so we're going to dive in and talk about our goals with delivering kind of the new capability around Validator macros. And so the big picture goals here and the pain points we were hearing from folks were, we wanted to make it easier to create new tests. Historically, Validator has been a relatively code-heavy experience. Most folks have to write a SQL statement of some sort in order to bring back data. And so we wanted to really help out with that and, give an experience where you didn't have to necessarily always be writing additional SQL or Python statements. And then secondly, or thirdly, we wanted to kind of show proven ways of getting data from complex systems. So databases and SQL against databases is one thing, but when we open up into the world of APIs or file systems, things like that, the amount of options of what you can do to bring data back is much larger than, you know, a SQL select statement. And so we wanted to get people you know, ideas and proven approaches to bringing that data back and seeing it very quickly. And then the final goal is, you know, because Validator is designed to scale everything via templates, everything that we did with macros needs to fit into kind of that template test model. So you'll see common themes throughout that as we go. And so just as a big picture perspective, the kind of workflow that is now provided via a validator macro, in creating a test, you still choose your data source, but then the drop down that asks you how do you want to get your data has more options than just the word script. And so you now are going to be able to select an individual macro in that drop down. And then the macro provides kind of simple metadata-driven user interface inputs that you can click through and select items or type in simple inputs. And so you don't have to write code yourself. You just need to provide values to those kind of metadata-driven inputs. And again, this is all going to leverage common patterns that are stored per data source template. So again, most common pain point is, hey, it takes skill and time we don't have to write SQL or Python code. You know, slows everyone down with building out test cases. And the second kind of most common pain point is we don't even know where to get started with testing a data source, a particular data source. So this is giving you some ideas of how to get started. And as I mentioned, again, these all macros are driven by our data source templates. So, you know, if you think about this from the perspective of a data source template represents the way to connect to, you know, Snowflake versus SQL Server versus a file system versus Tableau or Power BI. The ways that you're going to write SQL or Python against those also differ, and the out-of-the-box capabilities should differ for each of those. And so that's where we kind of manage it, is at that data source template level. And you know, you get to define the list of parameters you're going to ask the user and so forth. But for end users who are not as technical, they don't have to ever, you know, edit or manage any of these macros in the back end. But for your power users, you can. So we will show you all of that. Okay, so we have 3 examples that we're going to dive into in the platform itself, and I am going to pull those up, and you can see for yourselves. Okay. This should be popping on over here. So just as an example, I am going to start out in a new folder here and start a new test from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and click new test. And as we see down below here, we're going to say, what do you want to test? And I'm going to select my Snowflake data warehouse. And again, the default is how do you want to get this data as script? But now, listed out below there, we have other items available. And so in this case, what my goal for this test, and if I switch back to my example, the use case that I'm talking about is I want to compare my fact transaction table by date to the raw source. So I want to pull data from one table and group it up by one of the columns on that table the transaction date. So that is the goal there. So we're going to call this data by date versus raw. And so again, when it comes down to how to get the data, we're going to say, hey, I want to get a row count for each date. So row count grouped by a column. Once I select that, again, my script window goes away. And now I have a question of, hey, what table am I talking about? I can type in here transaction. That nicely filters to all of my transaction related table. I'm going to choose fact transaction down here. And then similarly on column, it's then the list of columns in that table. I can scroll down and find my transaction date and hit preview and initialize options. Out of the box then, it's pulled each transaction date and the row count, since that is what it had I asked for, row count grouped by a column. And so each different one of these macros is going to return data in a differently structured way, but each one is going to provide parameter inputs that you just select values from or type values into, and then it has the SQL and code behind the scenes that it will execute. You can always see what that SQL statement looks like by switching from the parameter input view to the script preview view. And if you ever want to edit this, you can hit the edit button and it will transition your test over to being in script mode again and just make this the script that it started with. So I'm not going to do that right now, but I just want you to know you can go ahead and edit them. And so now moving on down, it says simple to create another test or the connection to another data set as just specifying my data source. Again, I'm going to do another row count grouped by column. This time, though, I'm going to do my raw transaction table instead of my fact, and I'm going to group by transaction date. Again, we can hit preview and initialize options, make sure that's looking like it's in basically the same structural format. We can review, okay, where the transaction date is the key, the row counts are the values, and we might want to switch this and say, hey, evaluate these as numeric fields, and then we could add some tolerance here. Maybe we would say it's okay as long as it's within 1%. Simple as that. We've now created a test. One thing you will note, we have added 2 additional fields here, quality dimension and severity level. We're going to talk about those in a bit. They are required fields, so I'm going to save these. And this is going to be consistency between source and target. And this is a medium severity level test. If the transaction data by date is not matching, that is definitely a problem. It's not a critical problem, but it is a problem. So we're going to go ahead and hit save. And then this is another really nice feature we've added. When you save a test, Validator is going to go look and try to link that script that you've written or the parameter values you've provided to a macro to the actual metadata itself. And so this is going to further encourage us to link metadata back to the Explorer. And so this is just added out of the box. You can always hit ignore to not add the links, but it's best to kind of just hit accept for the most part. And so now we have test. No code was written by us to create this test, and we can go ahead and run it, and this will kick off and run all of those transactions, matching them up by date and bringing back the row counts. So that's our first example. I know there was a lot there. but hopefully this shows the power of being able to use kind of a no-code experience to still test your data from different sources, between different tables, and you can do that without having to know how to write SQL significantly. Okay, so the next exercise that we're going to dive into is how can I then adjust one of those macros as a power user for kind of my own use case? Because again, we come out of the box with some set of macros, but you can always customize them. I just saw a question pop up on the Q&A. So Sunshine said, do we need to configure a connection first before using a script data source? Yes. So again, you will need to have set up the data source connection. And when you set up a data source connection, you always choose a data source template. And so that is what would drive the examples or the macros that are available. So we're gonna show that right now. Hopefully that helps answer your question, Sunshine. Okay, so let's show this example. And just as a caveat for this use case, what we just did there with our fact transaction table, we were comparing row counts, but we might instead want to compare the percentages or the percentage breakdown between two tables instead of the row counts. And so how could we take an existing macro and adjust it, or even create a new macro? So that's the goal here. So to show that, I am going to go ahead and open up our go back to this release party examples. Here we go. So if you notice here on this test that we were just configuring, we had chosen Snowflake as the data source that was being used here. And so this data source obviously is associated with the data source template. So I'm going to go to the settings area and open up my data source templates and pull up my Snowflake data source template. And what you will see now is that there's below profiling, there's now a new section of each data source template. And in that section, we have a list of macros. Each macro here is then what you were seeing displayed in the drop-down list after the initial script option, right? So each one of these was an additional option. We go ahead and pull up that one we were working on, the row count grouped by column. We're going to see that macro has two parameters, the table and the column that you want to group by, and then it has a macro script that takes those values and turns them into a SQL statement. Again, this follows our same handlebars-driven templating approach, where each of these parameters is a placeholder that flows into this macro script. But what you can see with each parameter is obviously it has a name, a reference key, but then critically it has a type. And so the type here is what's going to drive the kind of user interface elements. And so for this table element, we had said, hey, this is actually should be of type schema and table, so that when you type in or when you're searching in there, the list of values is the schema table combination. Similarly with columns, this is the parameter name is column, but it's also a type column, which means it's going to display column metadata. And we've linked it to this parent table parameter such that once you have chosen a table up here, it will filter the column metadata list to just columns relevant to that table. But you could create your own additional parameter here. You could create a parameter of just a free text type or a drop-down type, as well as all of the metadata-driven ones of schema, table, and column. I'm not going to actually remove them. But you can also edit this macro script. And so just as an example, in this case, we had been talking about potentially wanting to add the percent of total to this row count script. And so I'm just going to update my here, and I just add in an additional count divided by a total row count to get my percent of total, and I had to join in a subselect to get that total row count. But just by making the change here and hitting save, if I now go back to that test that I had created previously and hit preview and refresh options again, this is now going to say, hey, not only am I bringing back the column you selected and the row count, you would now also have a percent of total. So I could quickly switch and say, hey, the percent of total is actually what I want to evaluate. And I want to ignore the row count, so forth. Again, because I changed it in one macro, it then applies to all of the places where that macro is referenced. We'll ignore that and compare the percent of total. And now we can save this and run the test again, evaluating a percent of total between the two instead of a individual row count. So that, again, these two examples here have both been SQL-driven examples where the macro is somewhat simple and it may have just one or two inputs. We have, lots of other examples of macros out here. And so just as an, so you guys can see this, if I pull up our Windows directory connection and look at the macros associated with something like this, you'd be able to potentially pull the list of sheets from an Excel file, or you could go ahead and, pull a particular sheet from an Excel file and then group by one of the columns in that sheet. And you'll see here in the code, when it starts getting into the world of Python, this can be significantly larger amount of code that we're providing as part of the macro, but it's consistently working with the approach you have. Okay, so I had, let me just check. I think I have one more example that I did want to show. And so this is an example where we're trying to address that feeling of, hey, how do I get started with a totally unfamiliar data source that seems, it doesn't have SQL available to write against it. It doesn't have kind of common metadata as much as I would hope. And so the use case here is to evaluate, hey, I want to connect to a Tableau data source and check that the fields and calculations for a particular Tableau data source are still matching what I expect them to, what they looked like previously, so forth. So just to dive into that example here, I'm going to come back over to projects, open up our folder, and I'm going to open up this example that is our Tableau data source field monitor. What you will see here is, again, now that I've selected my data source as Tableau Online, the list of macros here is not the same that was available on Snowflake. It's the one specific to Tableau Online. And one of these is just to get the data source field list from the data source. And so I just need to provide the project that that data source exists in and the name of the data source. And I can then hit preview and refresh options. And this is going to execute a Python script all behind the scenes and bring this back saying, hey, here's the list of, columns in that data source. Here's the data types. Here's the role. Some of them, if they have a calculation defined for them, it's bringing back all of this metadata, which I can then evaluate and test and say, hey, I want to compare, maybe the data type and the role and the calculation versus what those looked like on our previous run, and check that, hey, in comparison to the last time we looked at this table, nothing has changed. And if something has changed, I want to be notified of. And so we can save that and run the test. So I had two questions here while I go ahead and run this. One question was, do we have this same approach for Power BI? And the answer is yes. The Power BI one is, again, it will be processed through the Power BI API, but we do have a similar approach for Power BI. Another question was, what if your data source is updated near real time? How would you reconcile to your data warehouse? So the recommendations there are mostly around adding tolerance and or filters on one side or the other, so that you can manage for those kinds of late arriving data or real-time data. And so you want to test the things should match and not necessarily test things that have a high confidence in not matching between sides. So yeah, filters and then tolerance, adding tolerance to things. And actually, just to think about that, if I go back to a previous example, macros can be used to drive that type of approach as well. And so, for any of these SQL data sources, I could say, hey, I want to pull a table with a where clause. And here, this is, again, just setting you up with a quick way to pull data from a particular table with a where clause. So I can say, dim customer, where the customer city equals Dallas. And again, this is going to quickly preview, okay, what are the records where the customer city equal Dallas? If I had instead chosen, something with my update timestamp, and I had switched this filter value to be greater than or equal to X time, or less than or equal to some time, that's where I could then compare a fixed data set instead of all of the latest stuff that's more real time. So just an example there. And please keep the questions coming. Really appreciate questions and feedback. Okay, so let's jump back into our okay, so that was our biggest feature release, I think, of this list. But there are some additional ones that are really valuable. We're going to talk about is overall result stats for tests. And the goal here is to provide a single value that describes the kind of current status of a test. This is going to allow you to kind of easily see which tests are just starting to fail or just starting to error or have been consistently erroring or consistently failing, so forth. And then, this hopefully will drive clarity on which things should I focus on first. Maybe you need to focus within Validator on cleaning up tests that are constantly erroring because you built the test inappropriately. Other times, maybe it would drive clarity that, hey, something new just started failing in my production data warehouse. It's never failed before. I want to know about that immediately. And so that's kind of the overarching goals, is to provide easier ways to get that kind of single value describing the overall status, and not just a pass or a fail of the latest run, right? So the two examples here I'm going to show you are one where a test is failing, and then when we run it the subsequent time it starts passing. What does that look like? And then I want to show an example of kind of how you can report on all of these overall test statuses much more easily with our reporting capabilities. And just before I jump in, I did have a question around what happens when a test has a different source than the target. Will macros be able to manage that properly? And absolutely, the macro is really just about defining the connection on one side or the other side. And you could always do a macro versus your own custom SQL. You could do a macro SQL to SQL, or Python to Python, or Python to SQL, any combination of those. And so the macro doesn't affect the matching or the kind of evaluation process. It just is, how are we pulling data from kind of some of these more, from a data source. So, okay. Diving back in here. Where's my screen? There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and this test. So this is an example of a test that is comparing, again, using a macro, comparing data in a particular Excel sheet and pulling back the column profile values, and comparing that to another Excel sheet that should match, but is in a separately, or should match the data types and overall values. And what you'll see is we're bringing back the column profiles. And so if I go ahead and preview and refresh this here, you will see in this count data Excel sheet that we have multiple columns, and it's still thinking about pulling itself back. But the critical thing is the final column here is the date type. And that's really what we want to compare between the two files, because obviously the counts might be different since they are different files, but we're assuming that the format should be the same. So now we're going to check that. And historically, these two files have always had the same data types. And so what we'll see is in our top right corner, we have an overall status of this test has been passing consistently for the last 90 days. So I'm going to go ahead and run this test again, run to our test repository, and we're going to see if it's still passing, and then if so, what does that mean? So we end up finding out, hey, actually this did fail. It looks like our modified by and modified date columns went from one side being int 64 to the other side is now a object or a string type data type, and one is a date time, one's a string. So clearly something is off on this particular file, and the data types no longer match between the two files. So again, the failure is of an individual execution. But if I now come back to my test, I now have this overall status that says, hey, it was passing, but now it's failing, and it gives me the date when the last, basically the first failure kind of in this sequence, or sorry, the last non-failure, right? So the last time it passed was yesterday, but today it now started failing. So that's the goal of this overall test result status. You can't edit this. It's giving you kind of a high level perspective. And again, if you look at the history, you can see the history of when it was passing previously and then now it failed, and so forth. Other tests, and so what we're going to show you here is that if we go to our reports area and pull up our list of tests, in our test reports, we now have that overall result status as one of the columns that's available just at a high level when you're doing a report on your tests. And if I go ahead and add a filter on status, test overall result status is, you will see that we have 10 total types of values. So one status could be, hey, this test has actually never been run. Second kind of sets of status is consistently passing, consistently failing, or consistently erroring. Those are mean that they have only been one of those values for across the last 90 days. So if it's all, doesn't necessarily mean it's always been run, but if in the last 90 days it's only ever passed, it will be inconsistently passing. If in the last 90 days it's only ever failed, it will be inconsistently failing. So forth. The now failing, now erroring, or now passing indicate that you previously were one of these other ones and then a new type appeared. And so then, you could have been consistently passing and now you're failing, and so forth. And then the intermittent failures or errors, these are ones where you're going back and forth from, hey, it did pass one day, then it failed the next day. It passed one day, failed the next day. And so these are indicative of, something is kind of consistently switching back and forth between a pass and a fail. And so if I go ahead and select, let's say, intermittent failures and hit apply, we can now see example tests that have had intermittent failures over the past couple of weeks. If we go ahead and pull up one of these tests and look at the history, we'll see, yep, it failed, then it passed, then it failed, so forth. So it's kind of set as that overall, hey, there's some intermittent issues going here. I did have a question going back to, I think, the Excel question item about that Excel comparison was a structural check, yes, but you can also do content checks. So, we could have just as easily, when we set up a new test for that Excel file, have specified, instead of it being the column profiles, we could pull just the sheet data itself. And again, we could choose an Excel file here and choose just as easily. This is actually going to pull the raw data from that sheet, Mary. So, yep. So you can evaluate that as needed. And again, this is out of the box, but if you had said, hey, I actually do want to take this script and do some subsequent stuff on the data frame in Python, I read it in using kind of your standard approach, but I want to then aggregate or do, filter out certain records or something, you could always just come here and hit edit and then customize this as your own script. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent, but wanted to show that as well. Okay, so yeah, so as we showed, you can have, an individual value describing the overall result of a test, and then you can now report on that, and that field is available in obviously the tests, the test properties, and then the test execution history reports. So all of those have kind of the overarching status of the test available. Okay, the next thing I want to keep moving on to is our test severity and quality dimension fields. So the goals here are really, we wanted to capture more context about each test. And when people are building tests, they use them for all different types of quality checks. And so we wanted to get more specific and force people to kind of think through, hey, what am I actually testing here? What's the purpose of this test? So forth. And then secondly, that's for kind of the quality dimension. The other thing is certain tests really matter a lot, and other tests might be more just informational. And so we wanted to get that severity and be able to quickly report on the most critical tests, and differentiate them from maybe tests that if they fail or if they don't pass, it's not as much of an issue. It's more information. And then obviously all of this we want to kind of feed back into our reporting and analytics capabilities. So just to show you this, I want to show two things. One, these the drop-down options for our test severity and quality dimensions can be configured for you. They are considered kind of standard fields, not custom fields, so they are required to fill out, but the values in the drop-down can be selected by you. Similar to kind of an environment tag with a data source or things like that. And then I wanted to show, again, how we use that in a report or a subscription. So hopping in here. Sorry. Just a second. Here we go. Okay, so to configure the oh, and I did have a question about can we change the 90 days for the overall test result status? Not currently, Sunshine. That's a good request. Currently it is about 90 days or more. So okay, so to configure your standard fields, come into configuration, standard fields, and then this is where you can specify, okay, what are the different quality dimensions or severity levels of my different tests that I want to have here. And again, the severity levels are pretty standard, from informational, low, medium, high, critical. We have descriptions for each. The quality dimensions is where you could definitely expand on that if you wanted. I mean, you could add additional severity levels or rename them as needed, but this is a good starting list to get you a sense of what are the different kind of aspects of the quality checks that I'm doing that each one of these kind of falls into. So again, you can edit that, reorder them, all sorts of things there. And then obviously when you are building a test, these are now required fields. You have to set them. Any one of them, if you hover over, describes what that should include. And so you can get a sense for what does it mean to be a medium severity test. It's that it is expected to pass, and if it fails, the data or object should be being tested as untrustworthy. But a critical one would be, hey, this represents a critical business risk, significant downstream consequences, needs to be addressed immediately. So there's just that sense of, hey, what are the differences between these? By default, anyone who upgrades, all tests will start as informational severity level and will be set to a quality dimension of none. But as you create new tests, you'll need to set them to specific quality dimensions and severity levels. Okay, and then again with the reporting, we can always create reports on our tests, and with those we can add a filter to say, hey, I only want my most critical, or severity level equals critical, hit apply, and now I can have a report of, hey, here are my 3 critical tests, and maybe I could check, are they, what's the overall result status or something. Similarly, if you were in your test execution history, I could have an example of this. I could add a field filter for severity level equals high. Go ahead and hit apply and create a new report. Test execution of high. Update that, save, and then I could set up a subscription to this specific report. I don't know why it's not loading on me right now. But yeah, that is, oh, maybe I need to add a filter for date in the last 7 days. There you go. So now we have the one high severity test that was executed in the last 7 days, and we can get that it passed. Okay, so again, that's driving all of this stuff in any of the reporting areas. Let's keep on moving. The final feature that I want to highlight here is our Snowflake replication capability. And so again, this is mostly focused on people using the Powered by Snowflake approach, and particularly for Google or Validator Cloud instances, but you can also do this with a Validator Server instance if you're using the Powered by Snowflake. And the goal here is that we want to let you have access to all of your repository data. So all of the information about the tests you're creating, how they're designed, what you're tagging them with, all the metadata we capture, we want to make that available to you. And we want that to be in the same place where test result details are stored. And so obviously that's in Snowflake if you're using the Powered by Snowflake approach. And then finally, we want to enable some additional analytics that kind of go beyond the validator reports and subscriptions. Make sure people know that they can build on top of the validator platform as a whole, and use all the results in a whatever way they want. So just to kind of talk about this, I'll show you the configuration of the replication. And really there, it's just about defining when your data is replicated and exactly where it's replicated to. And then I'm going to show a quick little dashboard that's built on top of the replicated repository. And so you can kind of see, hey, what does it look like to aggregate those test statuses, quality dimensions, the severity, all that stuff that we've been building up into kind of an aggregated report. And this is really, I'm showing you it here because it's available already. A lot of the aggregation of the statuses and the quality dimensions, that's going to be added directly into the tool as well. But I did want to just show you, hey, already out of the box, because we replicated the data to Snowflake, you can access it really easily. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over one more time and come to our settings area. So in order to configure replication of your repository. Again, that's in settings, configuration, repository replication. And here, what we have set up is we just choose one data processing engine that you are using. Again, it's typically going to be your main Snowflake processing engine. And then you have to provide a schema where you want those tables to be replicated to. And so the default here, repository, should work well for most folks, but you could rename it if you have specific schema requirements. And then what you'll see below is that it is replicating up all of these different tables from our validator repository into your Snowflake instance. And I can validate that the record counts match between the two sides, see how many rows for each metadata table exist on each side, make sure that they're still matching, so forth. And then I can also adjust the schedule of how often I want this to be replicated. If you're using significant amounts of reporting on top of this, you might want it to go down to hourly. But if you're just using it for kind of generalized reporting and not as real time, you could set this to just replicate up daily, and you would then just have a good sense of the tests that were created as of yesterday and the metadata that was all done as of yesterday in Snowflake. So you can set that sync schedule as needed. But just to show what then it looks like, okay, bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to pull this up really quickly. One. Lock me out. One second. Yep. So this is now a dashboard that we've built on top of, again, the severity levels, informational, low, high, medium, critical, whether those tests are passing or failing consistently. And any one of these, I can then report on and say, okay, what are the 11 high tests and where do they exist, in which folders do they exist, and so forth. And then I can, look at which ones are consistently erroring and identify those tests and go and do something with them. Or I could track all of this stuff over time. But as you will see, if I open up one of the data source connections here, this is the list of all those tables that has now been replicated up to your Snowflake instance, and then also all of the views that are equivalent to, again, the standard data set reports here. Those have all been replicated up as well as the secure views that take into account user permissions and so forth. So all of that is now in Snowflake. Let's see, was there? I did have a question about Azure Blob Storage versus Azure Data Factory versus Snowflake. Absolutely, we can test for those, and we have multiple customers doing that exact same approach. So great question, Sunshine. And you can reach out to customer success about getting kind of a working session to prove that one out, Sunshine. Wonderful. Okay, so the final thing, and I know we have 3 minutes left. This is perfect. We did want to announce that we are having a community class of our standard validator creator training. This is going to be June 24th to 27th in the afternoons Central Time. And it is 4 sessions, and they are each 3 hours long. So it is a very in-depth training for kind of validator creators and administrators. It is not for just kind of validator viewers. And so those sessions cover automated testing concepts, kind of test management, generation, execution, automation. We have a whole session talking about kind of templates and deployment approaches. And then the 4th session is really focused on the catalog and governance and some more best practices. So we have a limited number of spots that are available for each customer that are complimentary. But if you guys have, larger group of your team that want to join, just reach out to customer success, and we can work out a deal for you guys. Obviously, this is our standard training that new customers receive for the most part as part of our onboarding packages. But I know lots of existing customers have not gotten the latest and greatest of the training, so we want to make it available to you guys. So please reach out to your customer success team and request a spot in that. It will all be sample data. None of it will be on your environment. It will all be in a public community environment. So yeah, really looking forward to that, and reach out as you guys have questions about joining. And yeah, so as far as cost goes, the standard cost is $500 per person, but again, we can give, with some of our very loyal customers, we can give you guys a couple of complimentary spots as needed. So reach out to your customer success team and you can get that coordinated. Okay, so it is 1 o'clock and I'm going to let you guys all go. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to our dev team who made all of these features possible. Really appreciate them. And thank you to you guys as our customers for giving us your time today and giving us the confidence to build a really cool tool for you guys. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.